The farm stood alone at the edge of the valley, far from towns, far from noise. The land was wide, filled with golden fields and broken fences. Wind moved slowly through the dry grass, carrying dust that sparkled in the fading sun. The farmhouse was old, wooden, and quiet. Just like the man who lived inside, his name was Thomas. A farmer whose life had been carved by loss years ago. Before the war, he had lived here with family, laughter, and the sound of children running between the barns. But war had taken everything, leaving only silence behind. Now Thomas rose each morning before dawn, worked his fields, fixed his fences, and returned to a home that never answered back. He liked silence, but silence was also heavy. At night, he often sat on the porch, staring at the stars, thinking how the galaxy had grown violent and cold. The great war between humans and other races had ended years ago. But scars remained. Many villages still whispered of alien raids, of widows wandering, of strange creatures left behind when fleets pulled away. Thomas tried to ignore all of that. His farm was his world, and he guarded it like a man guards the last piece of his heart. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, he woke with the sense that something was missing, something beyond crops, beyond silence. He would shake off the feeling, light his lantern, and tell himself that tomorrow would be the same as today. Safe and empty, that evening, clouds gathered low, hiding the stars. Thunder rolled across the valley, and rain began to fall hard on the tin roof. Thomas moved through the house, shutting windows and bolting doors. The farm had seen storms before, but this one carried a strange edge. The animals grew restless, the horses stamping, the dogs whining. He muttered to himself, "Something's off tonight," and poured himself a cup of black coffee. Then it came the sound that broke the silence. 3 knocks against the barn door, sharp, hurried, desperate. Thomas froze, his hand tight on the lantern. For years, no one had come to this farm at night. Not in storms, not in peace. He set down the coffee, grabbed the old shotgun from the wall, and stepped into the rain. The storm whipped against his face, cold and harsh. Lightning lit the valley, showing broken earth and endless dark. He walked carefully, boots sinking in mud, every step echoing in his chest. Again came the sound. Knock, 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 this time faster, like fear pressing from the other side. He raised the lantern and pushed open the barn door. What he saw froze him where he stood. 5 figures huddled together, cloaked in wet cloth, their heads bowed, their bodies shaking. The lantern light revealed pale skin marked with strange lines, eyes glowing faintly like dying embers. They were not human. Not at all. One of them, taller than the rest, stepped forward. Her voice cracked, weak from hunger and rain. "Please, shelter." Thomas gripped the shotgun tighter. His breath stuck in his throat. Every story he had ever heard about alien survivors, about widows left behind after the war, came rushing back. Some said they were dangerous, cursed, carrying powers or diseases. Others said they were harmless, broken souls who had nowhere to go. He did not know which story to believe. The tallest one dropped to her knees in the mud. Behind her, the other 4 followed, their thin hands clutching each other. Their clothes were torn, their faces tired, their eyes filled with grief. "Widows," Thomas whispered under his breath, the words sharp, like a blade. His farm had been silent for years, and he had protected it with everything he had left. Now 5 strangers stood before him, begging to enter. His heart beat fast. Torn between fear and pity, the rain poured harder, and the wind roared through the valley like a warning. If he let them in, he risked his life, his farm, maybe everything. If he turned them away, he would send them back into a storm that looked ready to swallow them whole. The tall widow lifted her face, her eyes meeting his. In them, he saw not only fear, but also a strange strength. The strength of someone who had already lost everything, but still clung to life. Her lips trembled as she whispered again, "Please, don't send us back into the dark." Thomas stood in the doorway, lantern in one hand, shotgun in the other, rain sliding down his face. The quiet farm was no longer silent. The decision he made in that moment would decide the future of his lonely life, and maybe much more. The storm roared above the valley, shaking the windows of the farmhouse. Rain beat against the roof like endless drums. Inside the barn, the 5 widows huddled together, dripping wet, their cloaks clinging to their thin frames. Thomas stood before them, shotgun in hand, lantern light flickering across their faces. For a long moment, no one spoke. Only the sound of thunder filled the silence. Finally, Thomas lowered the weapon, not because he trusted them, but because he saw the weakness in their eyes. He knew the look of people who had walked too far, starved too long, and carried too much pain. Inside, he muttered at last, his voice heavy, "Before the storm tears this place apart." The widows moved slowly, careful not to startle him. Their bare feet left trails of mud on the wooden floor when the lantern light touched their skin. Thomas noticed strange marks glowing faintly across their arms and backs, like scars carved by fire, yet alive with soft light. He did not ask about them, not yet. He led them into the farmhouse, the air filled with a smell of wet clothes and old timber. The kitchen was small, with a wooden table and 2 empty chairs. The widows stood together like shadows, whispering in a tongue Thomas could not understand. Finally, one of them, the tallest, stepped forward. She had dark eyes that reflected both sorrow and strength. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "We mean no harm, only shelter." Thomas studied her carefully. Her posture was proud, but her hands shook. Her body trembled as though it carried years of exhaustion. He nodded slowly and set the shotgun against the wall, though his eyes never left them. "You'll get one night," he said. "Just one." He pulled out old blankets from a chest, tossing them onto the floor near the hearth. The widows lowered themselves onto the ground, curling together for warmth for the first time since they arrived. Thomas noticed how thin they were, skin stretched over bone, eyes sunk deep. He remembered the rumors widows wandering, rejected, hunted, often starving before anyone dared to give them shelter. And now 5 of them lay on his floor, in his house, where no one but ghosts had lived for years. The storm raged through the night, but inside the farmhouse, another storm brewed. Thomas sat at the table, his coffee untouched, his gaze locked on the strange women. Questions filled his mind. Who were they really? Why had they come here? What did those glowing marks mean? And most of all, was he a fool for letting them stay? Hours passed, and the fire burned low. In the dark, one of the widows stirred, her voice breaking into soft cries. Thomas turned his head, watching as another leaned close to comfort her, whispering in words he could not understand, but the tone was clear grief, loss, and endless sorrow. The kind of pain that no storm outside could compare to. As the night deepened, Thomas stood quietly and walked to the window. The rain was easing, the clouds breaking, but in the distance, he thought he saw a faint red glow in the sky. Not lightning, not fire from the earth, but something else. Something. Searching, his chest tightened as he whispered to himself. They weren't just running from the storm. Behind him, the tallest widow rose slowly and approached, her steps cautious. "You do not trust us," she said softly. Almost as if reading his thoughts, Thomas turned, his jaw tight. "I've got no reason to." Her eyes lowered, and for the first time he noticed the shimmer of tears. "Our homes are gone, our husbands gone, our children taken." Her voice cracked. "We are only what is left." He wanted to ask about the glowing marks, about why soldiers might follow them, but he held his tongue. Instead, he looked at the way the other widows leaned on each other like broken pillars trying to stand. Despite himself, he felt a weight pressing on his chest, a mixture of fear, pity, and something else he couldn't name. "Sleep," Thomas said at last, his voice softer than he intended. "Tomorrow, I'll decide what to do." The widow bowed her head and returned to her sisters. Soon the room was filled with the sound of uneven breathing, of fragile rest after too much suffering. But Thomas did not sleep. He sat in his chair by the dying fire. Shotgun within reach, lantern low. His farm had been quiet for years, its nights empty and predictable. Now 5 alien widows rested under his roof, carrying secrets heavy enough to drown a man. As dawn began to break, Thomas's eyes caught the red glow again at the edge of the valley. This time it was sharper, brighter. Moving slowly like a predator on the hunt, he clenched his jaw, gripping the shotgun tight. His farm was no longer just his own. He had let strangers inside, and with them, danger had entered too. The morning sun broke through the clouds, washing the valley in pale gold. Mist still clung to the fields, and water dripped from the farmhouse roof. Inside, Thomas sat at the table, his eyes heavy with sleeplessness. The shotgun rested near his chair, the lantern dim. The 5 widows were still asleep on the floor, curled together beneath blankets, their breathing slow and uneven. For a moment, Thomas studied them in silence. Their faces looked softer in the daylight, no longer just shadows from the storm. He saw lines of exhaustion, thin cheeks, lips cracked from thirst. But it was the faint glow under their skin that troubled him most, across their arms, necks, and backs. Strange markings pulsed like dying embers, as though something alive burned beneath the flesh. When one of the younger widows shifted in her sleep, the blanket slid, revealing the full pattern on her shoulder. It looked like a scar carved by fire, yet too perfect, too symmetrical, almost like writing. Thomas's stomach tightened. He had heard whispers in the taverns years ago, of aliens who carried marks tied to power, of widows hunted because of what they bore, not who they were. Now those whispers lay on his floor. Under his roof, he stepped outside, needing air. The morning smelled of wet earth and wood smoke. The storm had broken branches and scattered tools across the yard. As he began repairing a fence, his eyes kept drifting toward the house. The farm had always been silent, predictable, but now even the sound of wind felt heavier. It was as if the very land knew secrets had crossed its boundary. Later, when the widows stirred, Thomas entered the kitchen with bread and water. They accepted the food with quiet gratitude, their movements slow, careful. The tallest widow, the one who had spoken the night before, gave him a nod of respect before breaking the bread into small pieces for the others. Watching them, Thomas felt both uneasy and drawn in. They were strangers, yet there was something familiar in their hunger, in the way they shared what little they had. It reminded him of his own family. Long gone after they ate, Thomas tried to speak. "You can't stay here," he said firmly. Though his voice lacked the strength he intended, the widows exchanged glances, their faces falling. Finally, the tall one replied, "We know." Her voice carried both sadness and defiance. "But we have nowhere else." Thomas clenched his jaw, gripping the edge of the table. He wanted to tell them to leave, to protect his farm from whatever danger followed them, but the words stuck in his throat when he saw the youngest widow struggling to swallow even a sip of water, her body trembling like she had not eaten in weeks. As the days stretched on, Thomas returned to the fields. Trying to keep his mind busy, he worked the soil, checked the animals, but his eyes always drifted back to the farmhouse. From afar, he saw the widows moving about, helping to clean the floor, tending to the fire, even repairing a broken chair. It unsettled him, yet also softened something in him. They were not acting like invaders, not like enemies. They acted like people desperate to belong, even for a moment. But that night, Thomas learned the truth of their pain. As the fire in the hearth dimmed, he heard a sudden cry, sharp, and broken. He rushed into the room to find one of the widows collapsed on the floor. Clutching her back, the glow beneath her skin flared bright. Lines of light stretching across her spine. The others gathered around her. Their voices raised in their strange language, their hands trembling as they tried to soothe her. Thomas stood frozen, shotgun in hand, his breath shallow. The tall widow looked at him, her eyes wet, her face twisted in sorrow. "She cannot control it," she whispered. "The marks burn when fear returns." Thomas's stomach turned. The marks were not just scars, they were alive, pulsing with pain and memory. He lowered the weapon slowly, watching as the widow's cries faded, her body going limp in her sister's arms. For the first time, Thomas saw them not as strangers, not even as aliens, but as survivors of something far greater than he could imagine. Whatever had been done to them had left more than grief, had left wounds carved into their very flesh. The quiet farm was no longer safe. Not for them, not for him. Somewhere beyond the valley, someone hunted them, someone who feared the power of those glowing marks, and now his farm, once a place of silence, had become their fragile refuge. That night, as the widows lay in uneasy sleep, Thomas sat awake by the fire. His hand rested on the shotgun. But his heart was far from war. He thought of the storm, the knocks on the barn, the desperate voices asking not to be sent back. And he wondered if fate had chosen him, a lonely farmer, to stand between 5 broken widows and the shadow that hunted them. Outside, the red glow appeared again at the edge of the sky. Brighter than before, it moved slowly, searching, like a predator following scent. Thomas clenched his fists, his mind torn. He could still send them away, keep his farm quiet, protect his solitude. But when he looked at the widows sleeping near the fire, fragile and scarred, he knew the truth. The silence of his farm was already gone, replaced by their hidden pain. And with it came a choice he could no longer avoid. The next morning came heavy with silence. But it was not the calm silence Thomas once knew. It was the silence that pressed down on the chest, warning of danger before it appeared. The widows moved quietly around the farmhouse, sweeping floors, tending the fire, and mending old clothes. But their eyes often drifted to the windows, their bodies tense as though listening for something Thomas could not hear. Thomas worked the fields, though his mind was elsewhere. Every sound of wind through the trees made his heart beat faster. Every shadow across the ground felt like a warning. The red glow he had seen in the sky still burned in his memory. It was no storm, no natural light. It was something hunting, searching, closing in. By noon, the farm dogs began to bark wildly, their cries sharp and restless. Thomas wiped sweat from his brow and looked up. Over the ridge, a dark shape hovered against the sky, moving slow, deliberate, like a hawk circling prey. It was a patrol ship, smaller than the great war machines, but armed, dangerous, and designed for tracking. His stomach sank as he whispered, "They've found them." He ran back toward the farmhouse, his boots pounding the earth. The widows were already at the door, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. "They are here," the tall widow said, her voice trembling yet steady. "They will not stop until they take us back." Thomas pushed them inside, shutting the door hard. His hands shook as he grabbed the shotgun. Though he knew the weapon was old, weak against machines built for war, but he also knew he would not hand them over, no matter the cost. The sound of engines grew louder, filling the valley with a deep rumble. Dust swirled through the fields as the patrol ship descended, its shadow stretching across the farm like a claw. The dogs barked until their throats were raw, then retreated under the porch, whining. Thomas peeked through the window, his jaw tight. Soldiers in black armor stepped out, their visors reflecting the sunlight, their weapons gleaming with cold precision. 3 of them spread across the yard, scanning the ground, Another walked directly to the farmhouse, his boots sinking into the wet earth. Thomas felt the widows behind him, pressing close together. Trembling but silent, he opened the door before the soldier could knock, stepping into the threshold with the shotgun in plain view. The soldier tilted his head, his voice sharp through the helmet. Human farmer. Reports say fugitives passed through this valley. Thomas's grip tightened on the shotgun. He forced his face calm, though his heart thundered in his chest. "No fugitives here," he said slowly. "Just me and my farm, the soldiers." Visor shifted, scanning past him into the dark of the house. Thomas stepped forward, blocking the view. His jaw set like stone. Behind him, the widows held their breath. The tall one's eyes burned with both fear and defiance, her fingers clutching the edge of her cloak. The soldier took another step closer, his weapon humming with power. "You will allow us to search," he said flatly. Thomas's mind raced, every choice heavy, every second sharp as a blade. If he let them search, the widows would be discovered, dragged away, perhaps killed. If he refused, his life might end here, on his own doorstep. The air grew thick, heavy, like the moment before a storm breaks. Finally, Thomas spoke. His voice low but firm. "No one but me lives here. You'll find nothing but dirt and broken fences." The soldier's visor tilted again, as though studying his face for cracks in the lie. For a long moment, the two stood in silence. One man against an Empire soldier. Then, from the distance, another soldier shouted, "Tracks, Captain, fresh ones, near the barn." Thomas's blood ran cold. The soldier turned sharply, his weapon raising. The widows clutched each other tighter, their marks faintly glowing beneath the cloaks. Thomas's hand gripped the shotgun so hard his knuckles turned white. "Stay inside," he hissed over his shoulder, though he knew they had no choice but to obey. Outside, soldiers moved toward the barn, weapons ready, their steps precise. The dogs growled from under the porch, their eyes flashing. Thomas's heart pounded louder than the engines above. He stepped out onto the porch, his shotgun raised. The captain turned back to him, voice sharp. "What are you hiding, farmer?" Thomas swallowed, fear burning in his throat. But he did not back down. "Just old tools." He said, "This is my land, and you're trespassing." The soldier lifted his weapon, the red glow of its power core humming to life. In that moment, Thomas knew the silence of his farm was gone forever. The hunters had arrived, their shadow falling not only on the widows, but on him too. The choice was no longer about whether to protect them. It was about whether he would fight or let his farmhand, everything left of his life, be taken without a word. Behind him, through the window, the faint glow of the widow's marks pulsed brighter. As if answering the danger outside, Thomas's breath caught. The storm of war had reached his doorstep. And the hunter's shadow stretched long across the valley. The soldiers searched the barn, their boots heavy on the wooden floor. Dust rose with every step. Tools clattered as they pushed aside barrels and crates. Thomas stood rigid on the porch, his shotgun steady, though his arms trembled. Inside the house, the widows huddled near the fire, their glowing marks hidden under cloaks, their breathing shallow with fear. Minutes passed like hours, the tension sharp enough to cut. At last, the soldiers returned, shaking their heads. "No one here, Captain," one reported, his voice rough. Through the helmet, the captain's visor turned toward Thomas again, still weighing his every breath. Finally, with a sharp hand motion, the soldiers moved back toward their ship. Engines roared, dust filled the air, and the patrol ship lifted from the ground, rising into the clouds until it was gone. Only when the sound faded did Thomas lower his weapon. His chest heaved as though he had been holding his breath the entire time. Inside, the widows broke in two. Quiet sobs, the youngest clutching the arm of the tallest. Thomas stepped into the house, closing the door behind him. his jaw still tight. "They'll be back," he said flatly. "They don't just give up." The tall widow looked at him, her eyes dark and weary. "You risked your life for us," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why?" Thomas leaned the shotgun against the wall, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the moment. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe because I've lost enough, and I won't stand by while others get dragged to the same fate." 4. The first time since they arrived, the widows spoke openly. The tall one introduced herself as Solara, the others as Myra, Asha, Yeleth, and Can. Their names carried the rhythm of another world, soft yet strong, one by one. They began to reveal their story, their voices heavy with pain. Their people had lived under the rule of an empire that feared them. The widows' husbands had been warriors, brave men who refused to kneel when war spread through the stars. Those men fought and fell, leaving their wives behind. But the empire did not only fear warriors. They feared the widows themselves. The glowing marks, Solara explained, were not scars but symbols. Each widow carried them since birth, gifts passed down through bloodlines. They were said to hold ancient power the empire could never control. And so, when the war ended, the empire hunted them, not to protect the galaxy, but to erase the last women who carried that gift. Thomas listened in silence, every word burning deeper into his mind. Solara pulled back her cloak, revealing the full mark across her back. The glow pulsed softly like fire beneath glass. "This is why they want us," she whispered. "We are reminders of what they cannot own, of strength they cannot crush." The youngest widow, Mira, spoke then, her voice thin. "They killed our homes, burned our villages, and scattered us like ash in the wind." Tears ran down her cheeks. "We walked through fields of bones just to reach your valley." Thomas's hands curled into fists, rage mixing with sorrow in his chest. He thought of his own family, taken by war, and suddenly their grief was not foreign. It was the same grief in a different tongue. "They will not stop until we are." "Dead," Solara said, her voice steady despite the pain. "But we cannot keep running forever. Our legs are weak, our bodies broken, but our spirit still burns." Thomas paced the floor, the weight of their truth pressing against him. His farm was small, just soil and wood. But now it was caught in something far larger. He looked at the widows, 5 women who carried not only sorrow but also a spark of defiance for years. His land had been silent, forgotten, but now it was tied to a fight he had never asked for. "Why come here?" he finally asked, his voice rough. Solara met his gaze. "Because we heard of a farmer who lived alone, a man who did not bow to the empire. A man who carried scars like ours." Thomas froze. He had never spoken of his loss beyond the valley, yet somehow his pain had traveled. Perhaps the world was smaller than he thought. Or perhaps fate had led them to his door. That night, as the widows slept, Thomas sat by the fire, staring at the flames. He thought of the patrol ship, of the soldiers who would surely return with greater force. He thought of the widows' marks, their story, their unbroken spirit. And he thought of his own silence, the years of loneliness that had buried him deeper than any grave. He realized then that protecting them was no longer just about kindness or pity. It was about standing against the shadow that had stolen from him too. It was about refusing to let the empire decide who deserved to live and who should vanish when. Dawn came. The widows awoke to find Thomas already outside. He was repairing fences, sharpening tools, and checking old weapons stored in the shed. The farm no longer felt like a quiet refuge. It felt like a fortress preparing for a storm. Solara stepped into the sunlight, her mark glowing faintly beneath her cloak. "Why do you help us still?" she asked, her voice gentle. Thomas turned, sweat on his brow, fire in his eyes. "Because your fight," he said slowly, "is my fight too now." The widows exchanged looks, their fear easing, replaced by something brighter. For the first time since they lost their homes, hope flickered in their eyes. And though the shadow of the empire loomed close, though danger pressed on every side, the farm once silent, once empty had become the ground where new strength began to grow. The days after the patrol's visit were filled with a heavy quiet. But it was no longer the peaceful quiet of the farm. It was the silence of waiting, of dread before the storm breaks. Thomas worked harder than he ever had, mending fences, digging trenches near the barn. Checking every tool as though it might serve as a weapon, the widows joined him, their hands blistered, their bodies weary, but they refused to rest. Solara guided the others. Her voice firm, even when her strength faltered, they gathered water. In barrels, stacked wood near the house, and cleared pathways between fields for quick movement. Thomas noticed the marks on their backs glowing more often now. Not with pain, but with a strange rhythm. It was as if the closer danger came, the more alive the marks became at night. Thomas sat by the fire with his shotgun across his knees. The widows spoke softly in their own tongue, sometimes singing songs, so mournful that the air itself seemed to bend. Other times they fell silent, staring into the flames, their eyes reflecting not fire, but memories of loss. Thomas listened without interrupting, his own heart heavy with memories of his family. Though he said little, his presence was steady, and the widows began to lean on it like a wall against the storm. On the third night, the dogs began to howl. Their cries sharp, desperate, Thomas rushed to the porch, his stomach twisting over. The ridge, the red glow, returned, brighter, larger, spreading across the sky like fire bleeding through the clouds. The hum of engines filled the valley, low at first, then rising, shaking the ground. This was no patrol ship. This was a strike. Force. The widows came to the doorway, their eyes wide, their marks glowing beneath their cloaks. They've brought fire with them. Myra whispered, fear breaking her voice. Thomas gripped his shotgun. Though he knew it was little against machines of war, "We don't run," he said, his tone rough but certain. Not anymore. The sky lit with fire as ships descended. Burning trails across the night, engines roared, heat pressed against the land, and dust rose in choking clouds. The farm shook as metal slammed into soil, and soldiers poured out like shadows given flesh. Their weapons burned red. Their armor glistened with cruel light. The widows clung together for a moment, then Solara stepped forward, her eyes fierce. "This is where we stand," she said, her voice steady. "We are not running again." The marks on her skin flared, brighter than before, casting strange patterns across the ground. One by one, the others' marks answered, glowing like stars waking in the dark. Thomas stared, his breath caught. It was no trick of light, something alive, powerful flowed through them. For years he had heard whispers, but now he saw the truth. The widows were not weak, not helpless. They were survivors carrying strength the empire feared. The soldiers advanced across the fields, their boots pounding like thunder. Thomas raised his shotgun and fired, the blast echoing through the valley. One soldier fell, then another, but more pushed forward. Relentless, the air filled with fire as beams tore through fences, burning wood to ash. The barn caught flame, sparks leaping into the night. The widows stepped into the yard, their cloaks falling away. The marks across their backs and arms shone like rivers of light. Solara raised her hands, and the glow spread outward, forming a shield that shimmered like glass. Beams from the soldiers struck it, bending and breaking against its surface. The other widows cried out in unison, their marks blazing brighter. The ground itself seemed to tremble beneath them. Thomas fired again, moving between cover. His heart pounded, but he felt no fear now, only fury. This was his land, his home, and he would not let them take it. The widow's shield pushed forward. Scattering soldiers, energy cracked the air. Glowing lines spread across the ground, and the attackers stumbled, shouting in panic. But the Empire had come prepared. From the largest ship, a machine rolled down. Its body black as night, its weapons glowing like fire in a forge. It aimed at the farmhouse, ready to burn everything Thomas had left. For a moment, despair gripped him. Then Solara cried out, her voice fierce, and the widows joined hands. There. Marks pulsed together, brighter than flame, brighter than the burning sky. Light erupted across the valley. It struck the machine like a wave, tearing metal apart, bending steel as if it were clay. Soldiers fell back, blinded, their weapons dropping from trembling hands. The very air hummed, alive with energy. Thomas shielded his eyes, his chest aching. As if the power burned through him too when the light faded. The machine lay broken, its fire dead, smoke curled from its shattered frame. The soldiers hesitated, their ranks broken. For the first time, fear shone in their eyes. One by one, they turned, retreating to their ships, dragging the wounded. Leaving the valley scorched but alive, Thomas stood in the yard, chest heaving. Shotgun heavy in his hands, the widows sank to their knees, exhausted, their marks dimming. Solara lifted her face, sweat and tears mingling. "We are not weak," she whispered. "We are not shadows." The farm burned in places. Fences broken, barn half destroyed, but it still stood. Thomas looked at the widows, their bodies trembling but unbroken. He felt something shift inside him, something he had thought lost forever. Hope. The storm of fire had come, and they had faced it together. The Empire would return, stronger, more relentless. But for now, they had survived. The farm was no longer silent ground, had become a battlefield, and in its ashes, new bonds had been forged. Stronger than steel. Asterisk smoke lingered in the valley after the battle. The air smelled of ash and burned wood. The barn stood half destroyed, its roof caved in. Fences broken and fields scarred with black lines where fire had touched, yet the farmhouse still stood. And so did the people inside it. Thomas leaned on his shotgun, his chest rising heavy with each breath. His face streaked with dirt and sweat. The widows sat on the porch steps, their bodies tired, cloaks torn, but their eyes alive. Their glowing marks, though faint now, still pulsed like quiet stars under their skin. For the first time since they had arrived, they did not tremble in fear. They had faced the empires. Fire and survived. The dogs crept out from under the porch. Tails wagging nervously, they sniffed at the widows, then sat beside them as if recognizing them as part of the farm. Thomas watched this small moment, and something inside him eased. His farm had always been a place of silence, but now it breathed. Again, filled with voices, with life. That night, Thomas sat at the table with Solara and the others. The fire in the hearth burned low. Casting soft light across their weary faces, he poured water into cups, passed them bread, and for the first time in years, he did not eat alone. The widows shared stories in broken human words, sometimes laughing softly, sometimes falling into silence when memories grew heavy. Solara looked at him across the table, her eyes steady. "You could have turned us away," she said quietly. "But you chose not to." Thomas took a slow breath, his hands rough against the cup he held. "I was tired of silence," he admitted, "and tired of losing." Her lips curved in the faintest smile, sorrow and gratitude mixing in her gaze. Days passed, and the farm slowly healed. Thomas rebuilt fences with the help of the widows, who worked side by side with him. They cleaned the barn, patched the roof, and even replanted seeds in the fields scarred by fire. The farm that once carried only loneliness now echoed with footsteps, voices, and the soft songs the widows sang at dusk. Though scars remained, both in the land and in their hearts, something new began to grow. Thomas felt it when Myra, the youngest, laughed while feeding the horses. He felt it when Asha, the quietest widow, hummed while hanging clothes to dry. He felt it most when Solara stood beside him in the fields, her cloak pulled close, her mark glowing faintly as the sun set. It was hope. Something he thought he had buried long ago, but danger had not vanished. At night, Thomas kept watch from the porch, his shotgun near, his eyes scanning the horizon. He knew the Empire would not forget. They would return, stronger, more ruthless. Yet he also knew he was no longer alone. The widows had proven their strength, their will to survive. And together they had turned his farm into something more than a quiet piece of land. It had become a refuge, a stand against the shadow. One morning, Solara approached him as he worked in the field. Her steps were slow, her voice steady. When she said, "We should leave, Thomas. If we stay, we put you in danger." Thomas paused, his hands tightening on the handle of the plow. He turned, meeting her gaze. "This is my land," he said firmly, "and it's your land now too." She shook her head, tears threatening her eyes. "You don't owe us this." He gave a faint smile, one lined with sorrow and stubbornness. "Maybe not, but I choose it. And I don't choose silence anymore." The widows stood behind her, watching, their faces filled with quiet emotion. For the first time since they had lost everything, they were not just survivors. They were family, tied not by blood, but by fire, loss, and choice. That evening, the valley glowed golden under the setting sun. Thomas sat on the porch, the widows beside him, the dogs lying at their feet, the fields stretched wide, still scarred but also green with new shoots. The farm was no longer just a farm. It was a promise, a place where the broken could stand again as the stars appeared. Solara spoke softly. Her eyes lifted to the sky. "We once thought the Empire had taken everything from us," she whispered. "But perhaps they gave us something too. They gave us this chance to find you, to find this place." Thomas said nothing at first, his throat tight. Then he looked at her, at all of them, and nodded slowly. "They took too much from me too," he said, "but they will not take this. Not now, not ever." The widow's eyes shone with tears, but not only of grief. They leaned close together, their hands touching, their marks glowing faintly in the night. For the first time, the light did not look like pain. It looked like belonging. The valley grew quiet again, but it was not the lonely silence Thomas once feared. It was the quiet of peace after the storm, the quiet of hearts finally finding rest. His farm, once a place of emptiness, now carried voices, warmth, and hope. It had become more than shelter, more than survival. It had become home.